You are about to witness the single greatest military humiliation in the history of the British Empire. One afternoon, 1,800 modern soldiers, 20,000 warriors armed with cowhide shields and iron spears, and a catastrophe engineered by a 9-inch piece of copper. Look at the shadow falling across the great rock mountain behind them. That mountain is called Isandlwana. The local Zulu people say it looks like a crouching beast waiting to strike across the plains. On the 22nd of January, 1879, that beast did not have to wait long. At 12 o'clock sharp, the blazing sun over southern Africa began to disappear. A partial solar eclipse turned the midday sky into an eerie twilight of bruised purple and dead gray. The African world held its breath as shadows lengthened in the middle of the day. And in that unnatural darkness, 20,000 warriors stood along the northern ridges in absolute terrifying silence. They did not shout war cries. They did not beat their oxhide shields. They simply waited, like a coiled spring, for the command to begin their charge. Inside the British camp below, the soldiers were not worried in the slightest. Why would they be? They were the vanguard of the most powerful empire in human history, backed by modern science, industrial production, and an unbroken tradition of global colonial dominance. Every British infantryman carried the legendary Martini Henry rifle. It was the most lethal handheld firearm on Earth. A disciplined soldier could fire 12 heavy lead rounds every single minute, piercing through iron shields and striking targets with pinpoint accuracy up to 400 yards. On paper, the tactical mathematics seemed indisputable. 6 companies firing in alternating volleys could create an impenetrable wall of flying lead that no human being could cross. 2,000 yards of open grass was meant to be an inescapable killing ground for anyone foolish enough to charge. And here is where things get interesting, because weapons are only as deadly as the supply chain feeding them. Behind those confident redcoat lines sat hundreds of wooden crates, holding nearly 500,000 rounds of live ammunition. But almost none of it was accessible. Each military crate was made of solid, seasoned teak wood, reinforced with copper bands and fastened shut by 6 heavy brass screws. To distribute ammunition to 1,800 soldiers, the entire British expeditionary column had been issued just 2 single screwdrivers. Think about that. Worse still, Imperial military regulations dictated that no quartermaster could open an ammunition box without signed requisition forms from specific battalion officers. In the rigid minds of the Imperial High Command, inventory protocol was more important than the terrifying speed of an African army. While British clerks worried about paperwork, the Zulu army deployed into their classic tactical formation known as the Horns of the Buffalo. The chest would pin the enemy in place, while the left and right horns swept around the flanks to sever every possible route of escape. At 18 minutes past noon, 20,000 men surged out of the ravines in total unison. The ground began to vibrate beneath thousands of bare feet. A deep collective hiss echoed across the hills like escaping steam as the horns accelerated toward the unfortified camp. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pullein stepped out of his tent and stared through his binoculars in mounting horror. The entire northern horizon had turned black with running warriors. There were no ditches. There was no perimeter wall. There were only canvas tents and open grass. The bugles sounded. The redcoats formed their thin line. The first volley cracked across the valley, filling the air with acrid white smoke. In exactly 80 minutes, this entire Imperial column would cease to exist. But to understand why, you must go back to the beginning. You must go back 3 months earlier, to the opulent drawing rooms of Peter Maritzburg, where one man's aristocratic ambition set this entire tragedy into motion. Lord Chelmsford believed he was going to conquer a kingdom in 3 weeks. Instead, he walked straight into history's sharpest trap. In December 1878, British High Commissioner Sir Bartle Frere delivered an impossible ultimatum to the Zulu kingdom. He demanded the complete dismantling of their ancient military system within 30 days. It was an ultimatum designed specifically to provoke an invasion. Lord Chelmsford viewed the Zulu army not as a formidable military opponent, but as an unruly mob that would disperse the moment they heard modern artillery. To London, he promised a swift, glorious march that would last less than a month. On January 11, 1879, the British center column crossed the Buffalo River at Rorke's Drift into Zululand. 5,000 soldiers, hundreds of ox-drawn supply wagons, and 2 modern 7-pounder artillery guns marched into sovereign African territory. The British military was built for industrialized European warfare. In the roadless expanse of Zululand, heavy baggage trains became a logistical nightmare. Each 2-ton wagon required 16 oxen, crawling forward at less than 10 miles every 12 hours. Local Boer commanders and experienced colonial frontier fighters pleaded with Chelmsford. They warned him that a Zulu army moved with terrifying speed and could strike 40 miles in a single night. Their advice was always the same: laager your wagons every single night. Chelmsford refused to listen. In his eyes, digging trenches or circling wagons into a laager was an admission of fear. In his official dispatches, he wrote the sentence that would seal their fate: "There is no need to entrench. The British soldier will stand his ground anywhere." On January 20th, the column reached the base of Isandlwana mountain and pitched camp. They set up their white canvas tents in pristine rows along the eastern slope, facing open plains. Not a single shovel of dirt was turned. Not a single wagon was chained into position. To the men on the ground, fortifications seemed completely redundant. The British infantry believed their Martini Henry rifles made them invincible. In volley practice, 6 companies could put down thousands of heavy lead projectiles every single minute. The .577/450 cartridge fired a massive 480-grain lead bullet wrapped in paper. At combat range, this projectile could shatter bone, tear through oxhide shields, and stop a charging warrior instantly in his tracks. British strategy relied entirely on this stopping power. In the rear supply depot beneath the cliffs, over 480,000 rounds of ammunition sat neatly stacked in army wagons. To the officers in camp, it looked like an endless reserve of firepower. But nobody was checking how fast it could be distributed. Look closely at the geography of the campsite. The sheer rock face of Isandlwana rose directly behind the tents, cutting off any retreat to the rear. To the left and right, deep erosion gullies, called dongas, created blind spots where an enemy could advance unseen. 50 miles away at the royal capital of Ulundi, King Cetshwayo had mobilized the main royal impi. 24,000 warrior veterans, organized into ancient regiments called Amabutho, marched toward the frontier without wagons, horses, or supply lines. A Zulu impi could cover 40 to 50 miles a day across rugged terrain, surviving on dried grain and driving live cattle for food. They moved 5 times faster than the British column, leaving no wagon tracks, no campfires, and no trace of their passage. While 20,000 warriors closed the distance, Lord Chelmsford's intelligence was completely blind. His reconnaissance patrols scouted only the open valleys to the south and east, convinced the Zulu army was falling back to defend their king's capital. On the night of January 21st, 1,800 men slept peacefully in their canvas tents beneath the shadow of Isandlwana. They believed tomorrow would bring an easy march into the Zulu heartland. Instead, it would bring the end of their world. At 2 o'clock in the morning on January 22nd, a breathless rider delivered a dispatch to Lord Chelmsford's tent. Major Dartnell reported seeing several hundred Zulu warriors in the eastern hills. Chelmsford took the bait instantly. Convinced this was King Cetshwayo's main royal army, the general decided to seize the glory himself before the enemy could slip away into the mountains. At 4:30 in the morning, under a cold gray pre-dawn mist, Chelmsford marched out of camp with nearly 3,000 men and 4 artillery pieces, splitting his expeditionary force completely in 2. Command of the unfortified camp fell upon Brevet Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pullane. 47 years old, Pullane was a veteran administrator who had spent decades managing garrison ledgers rather than leading troops under combat fire. He was a quiet, thorough officer who lived strictly by the rulebook. Pullane had never commanded troops under fire. Now he held sole responsibility for an open camp and 1,800 men. Before riding into the morning darkness, Chelmsford gave Pullane a single vague verbal instruction. He said, "If you are attacked, defend the camp." There were no orders to entrench or circle wagons. Chelmsford and his staff rode east, convinced they were closing in on a decisive Imperial triumph. They had no idea they were marching 10 miles in the opposite direction of the actual threat. Behind them remained approximately 1,800 men, 5 companies of the 1st Battalion, 1 company of the 2nd Battalion, 2 artillery guns, and several hundred colonial and native auxiliary troops. The veteran soldiers of the 24th Regiment watched the general's column disappear over the eastern horizon. The camp grew strangely quiet, the morning mist slowly burning off under the rising African sun. Routine resumed, as if on an English parade ground. Soldiers lit campfires, fried rations, brushed red wool tunics, and polished brass buttons. The unfortified camp felt as safe as a garrison in London. At 8 o'clock, Pullane sent a mounted messenger riding back toward Rorke's Drift. He ordered Colonel Anthony Durnford to bring forward his mounted native horsemen and rocket battery to strengthen the camp. Colonel Durnford gathered his 500 horsemen and set off across the savannah toward Isandlwana. But even with these reinforcements, the perimeter remained completely open to any sudden strike from the hills. Pullane sat at his folding wooden table outside his tent, methodically checking supply registers and troop counts. In his mind, military order and strict paperwork were the highest virtues of an officer. 10 miles to the east, Lord Chelmsford halted his marching column on a scenic grassy ridge. His staff unpacked folding chairs, boiled fresh tea, and relaxed, convinced the war was already won. Back at Isandlwana, the morning sun climbed into a clear sky. 2 halves of a divided British army sat 10 miles apart, while the shadow of the mountains slowly turned toward noon. At 10:30 on the morning of January 22nd, Colonel Anthony Durnford trotted into camp with 500 mounted native horsemen and a battery of rocket troughs. He was dynamic, restless, and senior in rank to Pullane. The 2 colonels stood over the campaign table beneath the Isandlwana cliff. Durnford wanted to take his cavalry into the northern hills to attack what he believed was a retreating enemy. Pullane urged caution, citing Chelmsford's vague command to defend the camp. Pullane strictly refused to give Durnford any of the 24th Regiment infantry, but he could not stop Durnford from taking his own mounted men. At 11 o'clock, Durnford rode out toward the eastern plains, splitting the defense yet again. Back in the camp, the midday routine resumed. Camp cooks stoked the fires for lunch, while private soldiers cleaned their mess kits and chatted in the warm African sun. To the men in the ranks, everything seemed completely normal. In the rear wagon park, Quartermaster Edward Bloomfield was meticulously reviewing his ammunition ledgers. He was an officer devoted to Imperial protocol. Every round of lead and pinch of black powder had to be properly accounted for down to the last brass casing. Each private soldier of the 24th Regiment carried 70 rounds of ammunition in his leather pouches. On a normal parade ground, 70 rounds seemed like an enormous amount. But against an army running at full sprint, 70 rounds would last barely 8 minutes. Pullane sent Captain Conyngham Cavaia's company up onto the high northern ridge overlooking the camp. From that height, they had a commanding view of the grasslands stretching for miles, but what they were looking for was deliberately staying out of sight. The British sentries stood along the rocky ridge in the bright morning heat, shielding their eyes against the African glare. The rolling hills ahead appeared completely empty, shimmering under a quiet haze of summer sun. But beneath that horizon lay a silent ocean of men. Just 4 miles north of those sentries, in the deep folds of the Ngwebeni Valley, 20,000 Zulu warriors sat shoulder to shoulder in absolute stillness. They made no campfires. They did not speak above a whisper. They were fasting and waiting for the new moon. Commanding this hidden host was Ntshingwayo Kamahole, a 70-year-old veteran of King Shaka's original campaigns. His orders were absolute. No warrior was to move, no spear was to glint in the sun, until the astrologers declared the omens favorable the following morning. A few hundred yards above the hidden ravine, a small herd of Zulu cattle grazed peacefully on the high plateau. To a distant scout, it looked like scattered civilian livestock. In reality, they were the unintended tripwire of the entire Anglo-Zulu War. At 11:15, Lieutenant Charles Raw led a patrol of mounted colonial horsemen up onto the Mabaso Ridge. They spotted the cattle moving along the edge of a deep ravine and rode forward to round them up. Lieutenant Raw pulled his horse to an abrupt halt at the cliff's edge. He leaned over his saddle and looked straight down into the sunken valley floor. What he saw in that ravine caused the blood to freeze in his veins. Stretched out across the bottom of the ravine, packed tight across 2 miles of dry creek bed, sat 20,000 armed warriors with black and white cowhide shields. As one body, 20,000 pairs of eyes turned upward and locked onto the horsemen. There was a split second of absolute silence. Then, without waiting for orders from their commanders, the young warriors of the Ingoma regiment leaped to their feet. The secret was broken. The greatest shock in British military history had just begun.
Keep firing, you blighters! Don't let them flank us! Reload! Keep firing! I'm reloading! They're advancing! Reloading now! Keep your heads down!
The time is now! We rise! Forward, Juve! Charge!
Fire! Present! Aim! Fire! Take cover! Sir! Hold fast! Prepare yourselves! They are coming!
Stay flat! Do not move! Hold until the signal!
I can't hold it much longer! Keep firing, soldier! It's too hot! Unlimber it! Get the trough free! Move those damn mules! Fire! Watch the hill! God in heaven! They're behind us! The western flank is broken! One. Only one left. Oh God, look out! Incoming!
On the far right flank, Colonel Durnford's mounted troopers galloped into a deep, dry creek bed known as a donga. Dismounting rapidly, they leveled their carbines to make a desperate stand against the surging left horn. The Basuto horsemen and colonial volunteers were crack shots. Firing with rapid precision from behind the earthen lip of the donga, they checked the advance of nearly 4,000 charging warriors in the tall grass. The Zulu left horn was forced to grind to a sudden halt, taking cover in the folds of the rolling terrain. For a fleeting moment, colonial carbine marksmanship had stopped an entire wing of the African army. In the center of the battlefield, British company officers drew their swords and shouted the command for independent rapid fire. The disciplined soldiers of the 24th Regiment immediately transformed into an industrialized shooting machine. The noise was deafening across the valley. Hundreds of Martini Henry rifles discharged simultaneously, creating an unbroken sheet of rolling white gunpowder smoke that completely concealed the redcoats from the enemy's sight. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pillane rode behind the firing line, watching the devastating effect of his infantry's volleys. The mathematical doctrine of Victorian firepower seemed to be proving itself true under the blazing midday sun. 300 yards away, the massive Zulu chest, the main striking force of veteran regiments, could advance no further against the relentless storm of lead. Their commanders ordered thousands of warriors to drop flat in the savanna grass. Lying belly down beneath the whistling hail of heavy bullets, the warriors began a low, rhythmic hum, gripping their shields and waiting with terrifying patience for the British gunfire to falter. In the British ranks, the mechanics of battle were reaching a frenzied peak. Soldiers tore paper cartridges, jammed heavy brass rounds into smoking breeches, and pulled triggers every 5 seconds without looking up. But the intense rapid fire began taking a severe toll on the weapons. Rifle barrels grew scorching hot to the touch, burning soldiers' palms through the wooden stocks, and baking black powder residue inside the firing mechanisms. While the center was held at bay, the Zulu right horn never stopped running. Moving silently through the rocky shadow of Isandlwana's western slopes, thousands of fresh warriors continued to circle behind the British rear. Half a mile behind the main line, Major Russell's British rocket battery was caught completely unprepared in rough, rocky terrain. The flanking warriors swarmed down from the heights before the rocket troughs could even be deployed. A single wild rocket screamed into the sky before the battery position was overrun. The mule-drawn carts scattered in panic, leaving the northern flank of the camp completely uncovered and vulnerable. Pulain turned his horse and looked back toward the white tents of his camp. He could see smoke rising from the rear ravines. The terrible reality was dawning on him. His line was being encircled. Out on the firing line, the redcoats were cheering, convinced they had won the battle by pinning the enemy center. But as soldiers reached into their leather pouches, their fingers scraped against empty bottoms. In under 45 minutes, the 1,800 men of the British garrison fired more than 24,000 rounds of heavy lead ammunition across the open grasslands of the valley. Think about that rate of expenditure. Each soldier had stepped onto the line carrying just 70 rounds in his white leather pouch. At maximum firing speed, 70 cartridges were consumed in minutes. And then the mechanical failures multiplied. The soft rolled copper cartridges expanded in the blistering chambers, their thin rims tearing away under the violent jerk of the steel extractor claws. Desperate soldiers pulled pocket knives and jammed triangular steel bayonet tips into hot chambers, desperately trying to gouge out stuck brass casings, while thousands of warriors waited in the grass. Along the 2,000-yard perimeter, the frantic cries began echoing down the line. "Ammunition! Pass the word down for ammunition! The pouches are empty! Send up the carts!" Selected runners broke from the ranks and sprinted across the hundreds of yards of open grassland toward the rear supply depot, their empty canvas bags swinging wildly against their hips. Because Pulain had deployed his men so far out onto the open savanna, every single runner had to cover nearly half a mile under the blistering African midday sun. Breathless and coated in red dust, the first ammunition runners reached the rear wagon park beneath the rock cliff, panting as they pointed toward their depleted positions on the plain. But Quartermaster Edward Bloomfield stood rigidly beside his heavy supply wagons. He looked at the frantic soldiers, glanced down at his leather ledger, and demanded official requisition paperwork. Bloomfield's supply depot was designated only for the 1st Battalion. When runners from other companies arrived, he refused to issue ammunition, shouting, "You do not belong to my battalion. Go to your own wagons." Think about the sheer madness of this moment. While 20,000 enemy warriors prepared to charge, British soldiers were being turned away from 500,000 bullets because of company accounting codes. And even when boxes were authorized to be opened, the physical trap snapped shut. Each teak ammunition crate was reinforced with heavy copper straps and secured by 6 thick slotted brass screws. The British Army had marched into the African interior with over 400,000 rounds of ammunition, but the quartermasters had brought only 2 screwdrivers for the entire force. Desperate soldiers grabbed heavy wood-cutting axes, attempting to shatter the sturdy wooden lids, but supply officers stopped them, warning that destroying government packaging violated military property regulations. Minutes ticked away. In the rear, men argued over paperwork and screwdrivers. Out on the firing line, the thunder of British rifles began to sputter and die into terrifying silence. On the far right flank, Colonel Durnford's horsemen fired their very last carbine rounds into the grass. With their pouches completely empty and no ammunition arriving from the rear wagons, the cavalrymen had no choice but to mount up and pull back. The withdrawal of Durnford's cavalry created a catastrophic 500-yard gap on the right flank of the British line. The defensive wall was breached, exposing the exposed side of the 24th Regiment Infantry to the surging enemy. The Zulu left horn saw the horsemen pulling out of the donga and leaped to their feet with a thunderous roar. 4,000 warriors surged into the open breach, pouring around the southern flank toward the unprotected canvas tents. In the infantry line, redcoats were down to their very last 2 rounds. Men cracked open their rifle breeches, holding the heavy lead cartridges in their shaking fingers, praying for the ammunition carts that were never going to arrive. Soldiers tried desperately to share what little ammunition remained, tossing half-empty packets to comrades down the line. But when 20,000 men are running toward you across open grass, 10 shared cartridges buy barely 15 seconds of life. Captain Mostyn drew his sword and shouted the command every British infantryman dreaded. "Fix bayonets!" A chilling metallic ring echoed along the rank as 18-inch triangular steel blades locked over smoking muzzles with sharp mechanical clicks. Then came the silence. The deafening roar of British firepower died completely away across the 2,000-yard line. The white sulfur smoke drifted high into the midday air, revealing the full, terrifying truth of the battlefield. From his vantage point on the ridge, Commander Inchingwayo heard the gunfire cease. He raised his spear high and shouted the command that sealed the Empire's fate. "The red soldiers' guns have died. Stand up and wash your spears." And at that exact second, the sky above southern Africa darkened into supernatural twilight. The solar eclipse reached its peak, casting a bruised purple-gray shadow across the mountain and the plains. Nature itself seemed to abandon the British garrison. Under that eerie twilight, 20,000 warriors stood up simultaneously from the tall savanna grass. Where there had been empty plains seconds earlier, there was now a solid, unbroken wall of black and white cowhide shields stretching across the entire valley. Lieutenant Colonel Pulaine saw his right flank disintegrate and realized his forward line was completely untenable. He ordered his bugler to sound the general retire, hoping to pull his scattered companies back into a tight perimeter around the camp tents. The bugle sounded the retire, and the redcoats began stepping backward in disciplined ranks, trying to maintain formation while facing their enemy. But stepping backward through tall African grass against 20,000 sprinting men is an impossible military maneuver. The massive Zulu chest launched forward into an all-out downhill sprint. No longer dropping for cover, 20,000 men closed the 300-yard gap at terrifying athletic speed, their iron-stabbing spears held low and level for the kill. Back in the rear supply park, the quartermasters finally dropped their ledgers and paperwork in sheer terror. Ammunition crates were left locked and scattered on the grass as the crest above the wagons swarmed with the enemy's flanking horns. 50 yards. The distance between Imperial firepower and ancient iron collapsed into nothingness. The thin red line stood isolated in the twilight shadows of Isandlwana, about to face the most ferocious hand-to-hand collision in Victorian history. At 1:15, under the bruised purple sky of the solar eclipse, 20,000 charging warriors slammed into the retreating British ranks with the shattering force of a tidal wave striking a breakwater. The 18-inch triangular bayonet met the short, broad iron-stabbing spear known as the eclipse. In the chaotic dust of hand-to-hand fighting, the disciplined firing drills of Victorian warfare ceased to exist. Under the crushing pressure of 20,000 men, the 2,000-yard British line fractured into isolated company squares. Small pockets of scarlet tunics stood shoulder to shoulder, surrounded on every side by an ocean of dark shields. On a rocky shelf beneath the southern shoulder of Isandlwana, Captain Younghusband formed Company C into a tight defensive square. With no ammunition left, 40 veteran soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, daring the enemy to come on. Out on the open grass, Captain Mostyn's men fought back-to-back in groups of 4 and 5. Using empty rifles as heavy wooden clubs and lunging with triangular bayonets, they sold every single yard of African soil dearly. On their grassy knoll, Major Smith's Royal Artillerymen loaded their very last canister round into the 7-pounder gun, discharging hundreds of lead musket balls directly into the charging ranks at point-blank range. With no ammunition left, the gunners seized heavy wooden ramrods and iron handspikes, defending their brass guns with desperate bravery until the battery position was swarmed from both sides. Behind the mountain, the two tips of the Zulu horns slammed shut like a giant iron vise. The right horn linked up with the left horn across the main wagon road, completely severing the route back to the Buffalo River. Thousands of warriors poured directly through the camp streets. White canvas bell tents were slashed open and trampled into the dust as the neat Victorian encampment dissolved into swirling chaos. Overturned ox wagons, scattered regimental paperwork, and discarded uniforms littered the trampled red dirt. The physical symbols of imperial authority were scattered across the African plain like autumn leaves. Retreating soldiers were pressed directly back against the sheer rock wall of Isandlwana. Behind them rose a 300-foot vertical cliff of solid stone. Before them stretched an unbroken sea of advancing iron spears. In the center of the disintegrating camp, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pulaine sat calmly at his folding campaign table, using a pencil to write a final, desperate message to Lord Chelmsford. Pulaine handed the Silk Queen's color of the 1st Battalion to Lieutenant Teignmouth Melville. His voice was steady as he gave his final order. "You must save the colors. They are the regiment's soul. Ride for the river." Lieutenants Melville and Coghill spurred their lathered horses into a desperate gallop, plunging down the treacherous rocky ravine known as the Fugitives' Trail, carrying the silk flag through the closing jaws of the enemy encirclement. Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pulleine stood alone beside his overturned camp table, his drawn sword resting in his hand. He did not run. He did not seek cover. He stood his ground beneath the mountain, waiting for the end. Near the southern entrance of the camp, Colonel Anthony Durnford gathered a mixed group of 30 colonial horsemen and 24th Regiment infantrymen around an ox wagon to make an unyielding final stand. A cavalry trooper offered Durnford a fresh horse to escape, but the colonel pushed the reins away. He refused to abandon the foot soldiers who had no mounts, choosing to die with his men in the dust. The defensive knot held for 10 brutal minutes. When the last revolver clicks sounded empty, the position was overwhelmed by swarming warriors, leaving only silent wagons and empty brass shells in the dust. High on the rocky southern shoulder of Isandlwana, Captain Younghusband's Company C held an elevated natural ledge. From this rock terrace, 35 redcoats looked down upon a camp that was already lost. Knowing that no relief column could reach them in time, Captain Younghusband walked along the ledge, shaking the hand of every single soldier in his company, thanking them for their steadfast service to the regiment. When the warriors scaled the rocky boulders, Company C met them with lunging bayonets and clubbed rifle stocks. The redcoats held the terrace until the last man fell, fighting with unmatched Victorian stubbornness. Beside the ruined headquarters tent, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pulleine stood in immaculate redcoat uniform. An administrative officer by training, he met his end with the unshakable dignity of an Imperial commander. By 1:30, the British command post ceased to exist. Scattered requisition forms, broken quill pens, and leather-bound ledgers blew across the empty campsite under the darkening African sky. 5 miles to the south, Lieutenants Melville and Coghill reached the churning brown waters of the Buffalo River at Fugitives' Drift, their exhausted horses stumbling down the steep, boulder-strewn gorge. Melville plunged his horse straight into the raging floodwater, holding the leather-cased silk color high above the churning foam as the violent current dragged horse and rider downstream. Lieutenant Neville Coghill had already reached safety on the Natal bank. Seeing Melville unhorsed in the current, Coghill turned his horse back into the torrent to pull his comrade ashore, where both officers made their final stand. The Silk Queen's color slipped into the river rapids, its rich gold embroidery and crimson silk floating silently downstream through the rocky eddies, where it would be recovered 10 days later. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the gunfire had ceased completely. The solar eclipse passed, and the bright African sun returned to illuminate an empty, devastated camp beneath the silent rock of Isandlwana. In under 2 hours, 1,329 British and colonial soldiers had been wiped off the face of the earth. Out of 1,800 men in camp, fewer than 60 Europeans survived. On the ridge above, Commander Nshingwayo lowered his spear and looked across the valley. There was no wild triumph in his eyes, only the deep, solemn realization of the monumental imperial storm that was now about to break. 10 miles to the east, Lord Chelmsford was still enjoying a leisurely afternoon on the sunlit hills. Distant, muffled thuds echoed across the valley, but his staff casually dismissed them as artillery target practice. Naval Lieutenant Milne climbed a rocky outcrop and peered through a high-powered telescope toward Isandlwana. He remarked with confusion that the camp's white canvas tents appeared to have completely vanished from the plain. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a solitary horseman galloped into the general's picnic site. Commandant Rupert Lonsdale, gray with exhaustion and dust, slid from his trembling horse with a look of absolute terror. Lonsdale looked straight into Chelmsford's eyes and delivered the words that shattered the general's career. "I have just come from the camp, my lord. The camp is in possession of the enemy. Every man is dead." Chelmsford stood motionless for several seconds, unable to comprehend the scale of the disaster. He whispered in disbelief, "But I left 1,000 men to guard the camp. How could they be overwhelmed?" Snapping out of his paralysis, Chelmsford mounted his horse and drew his sword. He ordered his entire 3,000-man striking force to wheel around immediately and begin a frantic forced march back to Isandlwana. For 2 agonizing hours, 3,000 British soldiers marched at double-quick pace across the rugged savanna, sweating under heavy wool uniforms as the afternoon shadows lengthened across the silent hills. As the relief column approached within 2 miles of the battlefield, the African sun sank behind the jagged crest of Isandlwana, turning the sky into a terrifying canopy of bruised crimson, violet, and burning gold. At 6:15 in the gathering twilight, Lord Chelmsford and his advance guard rode slowly onto the perimeter of the camp. An unnatural, suffocating silence hung over the entire 2-mile campsite. Nervous soldiers lit brass oil lanterns, holding the flickering flames aloft as they stepped through the wreckage. The warm yellow light illuminated overturned ox wagons, shredded tents, and thousands of scattered belongings. And there, beneath the wagon tarpaulins, the lanterns revealed the central tragedy of the battle. Hundreds of heavy teak ammunition crates, untouched and unopened, still fastened tightly shut with their 6 brass screws. Lord Chelmsford walked alone into the center of the ruined camp. He held a brass lantern in his trembling hand, staring at the scattered ledgers and empty tents, realizing that his entire invasion had been destroyed in a single afternoon. With no tents, no food, and no shelter, Chelmsford ordered his 3,000 exhausted men to lie down on their loaded rifles in the dark, bivouacking directly on the field of destruction beneath the looming mountain. In the pitch darkness of midnight, soldiers on the western picket noticed a flickering orange glow on the distant horizon, 10 miles to the west. Rorke's Drift, their supply depot and hospital base, was under ferocious assault. Under the cold stars of the southern hemisphere, the British Empire sat in the ruins of its own making. Dawn would reveal the full extent of the humiliation, but the news was already speeding toward London to shake the imperial throne. At 4 o'clock on the morning of January 23rd, pale gray dawn crept over the peaks. Lord Chelmsford ordered his column to march immediately before the full sun rose across the plains. The 3,000 surviving redcoats marched away in complete silence, leaving the ruined camp behind them unburied and untouched, fearful that the Zulu army would return with the morning light. Behind them lay the physical monuments of administrative failure, shattered transport wagons, thousands of scattered paper ledgers, and hundreds of tightly screwed wooden ammunition boxes resting silently in the red dirt. Chelmsford pushed his exhausted column toward Rorke's Drift, dreading what he would find. From 3 miles away, black plumes of smoke rose into the sky above the small border river crossing. Every officer in the column feared another massacre. They expected to find the small hospital station burned to the ground, and all 139 defenders wiped out by the flames. And here is where the story takes an extraordinary turn. Cresting the final ridge, they saw a sight nobody expected. The British flag was still flying proudly over the post. At Rorke's Drift, Lieutenants Chard and Bromhead did what Chelmsford refused to do. They built an impenetrable perimeter using heavy mealie grain bags and sturdy wooden biscuit boxes. For 10 straight hours, 139 soldiers held off 4,000 warriors behind their improvised barricades. Fortifications and common sense had done what raw pride had failed to achieve. 11 Victoria Crosses were awarded for the defense of Rorke's Drift. In London, the Imperial government used this desperate stand to overshadow the monumental humiliation of Isandlwana. Behind closed tent flaps, Lord Chelmsford sat down with ink and parchment to craft his official reports. He began constructing the narrative that would protect his reputation and blame his fallen subordinates. Chelmsford wrote dispatches claiming Pulaine had failed to follow orders and neglected to form a laager. He blamed dead men who could no longer speak, defending his own pride against imperial scrutiny. On February 11th, the first telegraph dispatch from South Africa arrived at the British naval station in Madeira, carrying news that an entire modern British battalion had been destroyed in open battle. The electric wire pulsed through underwater cables toward London. In 60 seconds, a message of 30 words destroyed the myth of imperial invincibility that Britain had carefully constructed for over a century. At number 10 Downing Street, Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli received the telegram. Witnesses reported the statesman dropped his teacup and stared into the fire in absolute frozen horror. London newspapers screamed the headlines across the empire. Disaster in Zululand, regiment annihilated. The greatest colonial catastrophe of Queen Victoria's reign was now public, shaking Parliament to its very foundation. In Windsor Castle, Queen Victoria wept openly when the telegraph arrived. Her private secretary recorded that the monarch was inconsolable, grieving the catastrophic destruction of her finest infantry regiment. The House of Commons erupted in bitter, furious debate. Members of Parliament demanded to know how an army, armed with modern weapons, had been dismantled by men carrying spears. In the grand halls of the War Office, senior generals scrambled to protect aristocratic reputations, pointing fingers at fallen officers who could no longer speak in their own defense. In Brecon, Wales, home of the 24th Regiment, church bells tolled for 3 continuous days. Black crepe ribbons hung from every door as an entire generation of young men vanished. The investigation revealed the absurd logistical failure. The British Army immediately redesigned its ammunition crates, replacing heavy brass screws with sliding panels and quick-release copper tier wires for combat. And here is where the story closes its circle. A global superpower was brought to its knees not by enemy artillery, but by administrative arrogance and 6 brass screws. London immediately mobilized massive reinforcements. 10,000 soldiers, heavy steam transports, cavalry regiments, and modern multi-barrel Gatling guns were rushed across the Atlantic Ocean to crush the Zulu kingdom. 6 months later at Ulundi, Chelmsford returned with a fortified double-rank square, using continuous Gatling gunfire to defeat King Cetshwayo's army, saving his career at the cost of thousands. King Cetshwayo had known the tragic truth from the very beginning. After Isandlwana, he remarked somberly, "An iron spear has killed an elephant, but another elephant will come to crush us." The Zulu kingdom was partitioned into 13 separate territories. The royal capital was burned to ash, and King Cetshwayo was captured and sent into imperial exile across the ocean. Lord Chelmsford returned to England in disgrace. Although Queen Victoria received him at court, the British War Office never permitted him to hold an active field combat command again. Sir Garnet Wolseley was dispatched to take over South Africa, ensuring that Chelmsford's military reputation was permanently tarnished in the history books of the British Empire for all time. 4 months after the battle, British burial parties finally returned to the silent slopes of Isandlwana, finding bleached white bones resting peacefully among the unopened teak ammunition boxes in the grass. In the Buffalo River Rapids, Major Black discovered the cased Queen's color caught between 2 granite boulders, its crimson silk intact, a tragic ghost recovered from the waters of Fugitive's Drift. The battlefield fell silent once more. The great rock mountain stood unchanged, having witnessed how easily technological supremacy collapses when chained to bureaucratic paralysis and institutional pride in the field.